At the pharmacy counter, I handed over a $60 bill to cover the medicine of a terrified elderly man standing in front of me. He was trembling, defeated by a system that leaves old folks behind. As the cashier handed back my change, the frail man suddenly grabbed my forearm. His grip was shockingly tight. His eyes darted around nervously before he leaned in and whispered a warning that chilled me to the bone. He said, "After your son leaves, do not rake the leaves in your garden." I was confused, but I listened. The next morning when I looked out into my yard, my knees nearly buckled at what I saw. If you are just discovering this story, take a deep breath, because what I'm about to share is a nightmare I never thought possible in my own home, orchestrated by my own flesh and blood. My name is Norbert Caulfield. I am 70 years old, a retired civil engineer, and I live a quiet life in suburban Maine. For 4 decades, my hands were calloused from gripping steel rebar and gauging the integrity of heavy structures. My adult life was spent raising foundations capable of withstanding earthquakes, floods, and the slow grind of time. I believed I understood what it meant to build something solid, but nothing across all those years in engineering had readied me for the poisonous fractures spreading through the foundation of my own family. Welcome back to Grandpa's Revenge. I'm glad you're here with me today. If this channel has ever made you feel seen, tap subscribe, so the next story finds its way to you. Before we go any further, I want to ask you something simple. In one word, what does this story stir up inside you? Drop it in the comments. I read every single one. Now, a quick note, some details in this story have been shaped for the purpose of storytelling, and any resemblance to specific real people or events is purely coincidental. What matters is the truth at the heart of it. Since my wife passed away 3 years ago, I have lived alone in the house we built together. It is a large home, ringed by ancient oak trees that shed a mountain of dry leaves every autumn. Working the yard kept my old hands occupied and my mind off the empty chair at my dinner table. It was a brisk Tuesday afternoon when I drove my pickup truck down to the local pharmacy for my cholesterol medication. The bell above the door chimed as I stepped inside, shaking off the autumn chill. Ahead of me in line stood an elderly man who looked incredibly frail, wearing a faded navy coat that hung loosely off his stooped shoulders. He was nervously digging through a battered wallet, his spotted hands trembling violently as the young cashier politely informed him that he was $47 short for his heart medication. I stood quietly and watched him. He looked terrified, frantically patting empty pockets for loose dollar bills that simply were not there. I know what it is to feel invisible once you get older, to be made to feel like a burden. I stepped up, pulled a $60 bill from my money clip, set it on the counter, and told the cashier to put the balance on my tab and keep the change. The old man turned slowly to face me. His face was deeply weathered, his eyes sunken and bloodshot. I expected a simple thank you. What I got instead was a stare of raw, haunting desperation that raised every hair on the back of my neck. He reached out and locked onto my forearm. For a man who looked like a gust of wind might carry him off. His fingers drove into my heavy flannel jacket with the terrifying grip of someone clinging to their last lifeline. He pulled in very close, his breath rattling wetly in his weak chest, and whispered those words straight into my ear. "After your son leaves, do not rake the leaves in your garden." I went completely still. The cashier was busy bagging pill bottles, entirely oblivious to the strange exchange unfolding right in front of her. My analytical mind raced to make any sense of what he had just said. How on earth did this man know I had a son? I had never laid eyes on him before in my life. Our town is small, but not that small. And why would a complete stranger be concerned about my yard work? I opened my mouth to demand how he knew anything about my private family, but before the words could even form in my dry throat, he snatched the pharmacy bag from the counter, released my aching arm, and practically bolted for the exit. He moved with a frantic, paranoid energy, throwing nervous glances over his shoulder before pushing through the glass doors and dissolving into the cold, gray afternoon. I stood in stunned silence, collected my bags from the cashier, and said nothing. The drive home felt like a disorienting blur. The truck's heater was running full blast, yet I could not shake the icy feeling taking root deep in my chest. My son Prescott is 38 years old, a commercial real estate developer, an aggressive businessman always chasing the next lucrative deal. He and his ambitious wife Vivienne live in a sleek luxury townhouse in the city an hour from my quiet street. They rarely come out to see me unless it is a major holiday obligation, or they need something from me. The deeply unsettling fact that a terrified stranger at a random pharmacy was putting my son and my backyard in the same sentence felt like an impossible puzzle. As a civil engineer, my mind is wired to seek clean logic, but there was no logic here. Only a creeping dark intuition coiling around my heart, telling me something was terribly wrong. I turned the final corner onto my street, my tires crunching over fallen leaves as my familiar house appeared at the end of the cul-de-sac. My lingering confusion hardened instantly into a cold, heavy weight in my gut. Sitting squarely in my driveway was a sleek, immaculate black luxury SUV, Prescott's car. My pulse quickened. Prescott never visited on a random Tuesday afternoon, and he certainly never drove out to the suburbs without so much as a text. I eased my truck in, slowly killed the engine, and sat in the sudden quiet of the cab. Through the dusty windshield, I could see them plainly. Prescott and Vivienne were standing together on my elevated front porch, not facing the driveway to greet me the way family does, but turned toward my sprawling, leaf-covered backyard. Prescott was pointing aggressively at the ground, his index finger tracing an invisible, calculated line across the property, as though he were staking out a new construction lot. Vivienne stood close beside him, a thick stack of glossy brochures tucked under her manicured arm. But it was the expression on their faces that made my seasoned blood run cold. They were smiling, not the warm, open smiles of a son and daughter-in-law carving out time to visit their aging father. It was a cold, calculated, distinctly predatory smile, the same hungry look an opportunistic contractor wears right before he tears down an old building to pour the foundation for a profitable high-rise. I sat frozen in the cab, hands wrapped around the steering wheel, while the old man's desperate warning echoed in my head. After your son leaves, do not rake the leaves in your garden. I drew a long, slow breath, steadied my nerves, and shoved the truck door open to face whatever dark storm my own flesh and blood had carried to my front step. I shut the door behind me. Walking up that driveway felt like crossing into enemy territory. Prescott and Vivienne turned their predatory smiles, dissolving instantly into rehearsed warmth. Prescott stepped forward and clapped my shoulder with manufactured enthusiasm, announcing it was a spontaneous visit he wanted to take me out to dinner. I knew my son. Prescott never did anything spontaneously. Every move he made was a calculated investment. I unlocked the door and let them in. The air inside felt immediately dense, thick, with an unspoken agenda. I went to the kitchen to warm the dinner I had already prepared while they settled at the table. When I brought the plates out, I studied them, the way I always studied a structure, looking for where the stress points live. Prescott wore a tailored suit that cost more than my first car. A platinum watch gleamed on his wrist. Vivienne was draped in designer silk, her fingers loaded with diamonds. My structural engineer's eye saw it all for what it was, a fragile facade. Setting the plates down, my mind drifted to how Prescott was raised. My late wife and I worked without complaint to give him an honest childhood. We saved for years to put him through college, driving old cars, eating modest meals so he could study without the weight of student loans. We taught him what a dollar was worth. We believed we had raised a man of integrity. Yet the person sitting across from me, now cutting into his beef with quiet arrogance, looked like a stranger. A man who placed money above everything else. We ate in silence for a few minutes, the sharp clinking of silverware on porcelain, the only sound in the room. Then Prescott cleared his throat and exchanged a loaded glance with Vivienne. He reached into his expensive briefcase and produced a stack of glossy brochures, sliding them deliberately across the polished table toward me. The bold lettering on top read, Birchwood Pines Manor, Luxury Assisted Living. I stared down at the pamphlets and felt a cold knot tighten in my stomach. Prescott leaned forward, his voice wrapped in a performance of concerned son. He said that he and Vivienne had been discussing my living situation. He noted the house was simply too large for one person to maintain, especially a man my age. He claimed they worried constantly about what would happen if a medical emergency struck when I was alone. He spoke about Birchwood Pines Manor's golf course, its on-call medical staff, its vibrant community. He framed the whole idea as a permanent vacation, a well-earned reward after a lifetime of hard labor. Vivienne reached across the table and laid her perfectly manicured hand over mine. Her skin felt unnaturally cool against my warm knuckles. She tilted her head, her face arranged into a portrait of manufactured saccharine sympathy. She said softly that they only wanted what was absolutely best for me. Then she looked me directly in the eyes and delivered a line that turned the blood in my veins to ice. You should not be out there raking leaves at your age, Dad. It is incredibly dangerous. You could easily slip and fall, and absolutely no one would even know. The words settled into the air quiet and deliberate. Raking leaves. My mind snapped straight back to the terrified, shaking old man at the pharmacy counter, his desperate, crushing grip on my arm, his raspy voice warning me not to rake the leaves in my garden after my son left. It was a coincidence too precise to be a coincidence at all. Vivienne could have mentioned shoveling snow, or clearing the high gutters, or patching the roof, but she had chosen the leaves, specifically deliberately the leaves. The identical obscure detail the frightened stranger had pressed into my ear just a few hours earlier. My heart hammered hard against my ribs, but 4 decades of navigating high-pressure construction disputes kept my face a perfect blank. Not a trace of the panic surging through me made it to the surface. I drew my hand slowly, deliberately out from under Vivienne's cold palm. I lifted the stack of glossy brochures, tapped them squarely against the table, and slid them right back across to Prescott. I kept my voice low and unhurried, every syllable measured, every word stripped of visible emotion. I told them I genuinely appreciated their concern, but I was perfectly content exactly where I was. I reminded them both that I had built this house with my own 2 hands, and I had no intention of walking away from it. My health was strong, my mind was sharp, and I took real satisfaction in maintaining my own property. The subject, I told them, was closed. Prescott's jaw tightened. The warm mask slipped for a fraction of a second, and a flash of raw, burning frustration broke through. He started to push back, ready to press the argument harder, but Vivienne caught him with a sharp kick under the table. I noticed the slight involuntary shift in her posture, and the dark, silent signal in the look she sent him. Prescott swallowed it down and forced the pleasant smile back onto his face. He said smoothly that they completely understood and that the option at Birchwood Pines Manor would always be there if I ever changed my mind. What remained of the dinner was excruciating. The conversation dried up almost immediately, replaced by a smothering tension that pressed into every corner of the room. The moment the meal was done, they were suddenly in a tremendous hurry to leave. The visit ended when the pitch failed. I stood to clear the dishes, carrying the plates toward the sink. As I turned my back, I caught their reflection in the dark face of the microwave. Prescott was furiously typing on his phone, thumbs moving with desperate speed. His face was pale and damp. He was not firing off a casual text. He was sending an urgent warning to someone. I turned on the cold water, letting the noise fill the kitchen, and leaned over the stainless steel sink to look out into the backyard. The sun had begun to set, throwing long, dark shadows across the lawn. The autumn wind moved softly through the thick blanket of unraked brown and orange leaves blanketing the ground. But as my eyes tracked the edge of the property, my breath caught. Running straight through the grass from the back gate toward the largest leaf pile were deep tire tracks, heavy vehicle treads pressed firmly into the damp, soft soil. Those tracks had not been there that morning when I left for the pharmacy. Someone had been on my property without permission. I did not sleep that night. I sat in the worn leather armchair by the living room window, working through a cup of cold black coffee and watching moonlight drag long shadows across the unraked leaves below. My mind, trained across 4 decades to calculate load tolerances and structural stress, was now grinding through the weight of my own son's deception. The tire tracks gouged into my grass were an undeniable anomaly, a glaring error in the quiet equation of my retirement. As dawn finally broke, painting the suburban Maine sky in pale shades of gray, I heard the heavy floorboards creak above me. Prescott and Vivienne were up. I sat perfectly still, tracking the muffled sounds of their morning routine. The sharp click of Vivienne's designer heels on hardwood. The low, businesslike cadence of Prescott's voice on his cell phone, words too hushed to catch tone, too urgent to mistake. At exactly 7:00 in the morning, they came downstairs. I let my stiff muscles go loose and arranged my face into the look of a tired, oblivious old man. Prescott walked into the kitchen in another crisp suit, tossing his empty disposable coffee cup into the stainless steel trash can by the counter. He gave me a warm smile, said he had a heavy day at the firm, but would check in later. Vivienne offered me one of those cloying manufactured smiles, reminding me to give the Birchwood Pines Manor brochures serious thought. I nodded, gave them a slow, agreeable wave, and watched them walk out the front door. The heavy oak door clicked shut. I waited exactly 5 minutes. I watched from the window as Prescott's black SUV backed out of the driveway and disappeared down the street. When the coast was clear, I let out a long breath. The performance had been exhausting. I walked into the kitchen and my eyes went straight to the trash can where Prescott had dropped his cup. A quiet, persistent instinct nudged me forward. I stepped over, lifted the lid, and looked inside. Resting on top of the previous day's newspaper was Prescott's crumpled paper cup, but it was not empty. Jammed inside the cardboard sleeve was a tightly folded wad of thick paper. I reached in and pulled it free. My calloused fingers recognized the texture at once. High-grade architectural drafting paper. My pulse thickened to a slow, steady knock against my ribs as I carried it to the granite island. I smoothed it carefully under the bright kitchen lights. I put on my reading glasses. For 40 years, I had parsed complex blueprints, city grids, and topological surveys. I could read a schematic the way most men read the morning news. What lay in front of me was not a general zoning map. It was a precise, detailed topographical scan. And the boundaries were intimately familiar. I traced the ink lines with one finger, my throat tightening. It was my property, an exact professional rendering of my house, my driveway, and my sprawling backyard. The scan was heavily annotated in red ink. Someone had recorded meticulous measurements of the soil density and elevation changes across the lot. But what froze the blood in my veins were 3 large red X marks drawn squarely over the deepest pile of unraked leaves near the back fence. Written beside them in Prescott's aggressive, unmistakable handwriting were 2 words, excavation target. The grief I had carried since my wife died evaporated in that instant. It did not become sadness. It became solid, impenetrable ice, an excavation target, in my own backyard, a professional survey done entirely without my knowledge. The heavy machinery tracks suddenly made terrifying sense. I stared at the red ink, my mind rapidly assembling the fragments of the past year. 6 months ago, Prescott had been drowning. His commercial development firm was bleeding money, tangled in lawsuits, buried in debt. He had come to me, desperate and sweating, asking for a loan. I refused to hand him a blank check, offering instead to help him restructure his business plan. He had been furious. Then, almost overnight, every problem vanished. The debts were paid off. The luxury townhouse appeared. The expensive suits, the pristine SUV. He told me he had landed a massive confidential investor. And right around that same moment, his sudden deep concern for my mortality had begun. 6 months ago, he started pressing me to update my will. He brought lawyers to the house, pushing me to sign documents granting him full power of attorney over my estate, framing it as simple, sensible preparation. He wanted unrestricted control over this specific piece of land. I stood motionless in the silent kitchen, staring down at the blueprint that proved my own flesh and blood did not see a father when they looked at me. They saw a temporary obstacle standing on top of a valuable secret. Prescott did not want me in an assisted living facility because he was worried about my health. He wanted me out of the way so he could tear up my backyard without interference. The terrifying question was no longer what they were doing. The question was what exactly lay buried beneath those unraked leaves, something valuable enough to justify destroying his own family to get at it. That grim train of thought was shattered by the shrill, sudden ringing of the landline mounted on the kitchen wall. The sound made me flinch, my heart slamming against my chest. I stared at the phone through a long, frozen moment, my hands trembling slightly. I drew a slow breath, steadied myself, and lifted the receiver to my ear. A cautious, quiet, "Hello." The voice on the other end was panicked, breathless, coming apart at the seams. It was the pharmacy manager. He asked whether I was the man who had paid for the elderly gentleman's medication the previous afternoon. A cold knot formed in my stomach as I confirmed that I was. The manager's voice cracked with barely concealed fear when he delivered his next words. He said the police had just arrived at the plaza. Mr. Huxley, the frail old man I had helped, had been found in the narrow alley behind the pharmacy, brutally beaten, left, fighting for his life in a pool of his own blood. I dropped the receiver. It clattered against the granite countertop, and I did not go back for it. I grabbed my keys from the hook and sprinted to my truck with an agility I had not felt in years. The drive to the county hospital was a blur of traffic lights and squealing tires. My mind, normally a disciplined engine of logic and structure, was spinning completely out of control. For 40 years I had calculated the breaking points of steel, but there was no formula for this. A frail man I had known for exactly 2 minutes was now in a hospital bed, beaten near to death, because he dared to warn me about my own son. When I slammed the truck into park at the emergency room entrance, the cold night air hit me like an open hand. I pushed through the sliding glass doors into the harsh fluorescent light of the waiting area. A security guard near the triage desk asked for identification and patient relation. I had no patience for bureaucratic obstruction. I drew myself up to full height, channeling the commanding authority I had wielded on major construction sites for decades, and told the guard without a flicker of hesitation that I was Clarence Huxley's older brother. I demanded to see him at once. The guard wavered, clearly unsettled by the certainty in my voice, and directed me to the intensive care unit on the 3rd floor. I did not wait for a second invitation. My boots struck the floor in heavy, deliberate strides. The ICU was a bleak maze of hushed corridors and softly beeping machines. The sharp bite of antiseptic burned in my nostrils as I navigated the winding hallways. His room was at the far end of the corridor. Peering cautiously through the small glass window in the door, my heart dropped. Mr. Huxley looked impossibly small against the expanse of the hospital bed. His face was a canvas of deep purple, black, and yellow bruising. Clear plastic tubes and thick wires ran from his arms and chest, anchoring him to a wall of monitors that pulsed with a fragile, erratic rhythm. I eased the heavy door open and stepped quietly into the dim room. The mechanical hiss of the ventilator was the only sound breaking the silence. I stood beside the bed, looking down at his battered hands, the same spotted hands that had gripped my forearm with such ferocious strength just the previous afternoon. A wave of guilt and fury moved through me like a structural shockwave. This man was entirely innocent. He was collateral damage in a dark game being played in my own backyard. I leaned close and spoke his name softly, hoping my voice might cut through the fog of trauma and pain medication. For a long, agonizing stretch, nothing moved. Then his swollen eyelids fluttered. His bloodshot eyes drifted across the room before finally settling on my face. A weak flicker of recognition ignited in his dull gaze. He tried to lift his head from the pillow, but he had nothing left. I placed my hand gently over his and urged him to stay still. His chest heaved with a wet, rattling breath against the mechanical rhythm of the ventilator. He found my fingers and held on. His dry lips parted, and he pushed the words out with visible, agonizing effort. He gasped barely a broken whisper. Prescott's partners. They needed a clean name. The soil. A harsh cough tore through his frail frame. He squeezed my hand one last time, his eyes wide with a desperate, lingering terror. He tried to speak again, tried to finish it, but his body surrendered. The monitors erupted into a piercing, flat alarm. The green line tracking his heart rate jagged once, and then went perfectly still. The door crashed open behind me. A team of doctors and nurses flooded the room, shouting codes, pushing me back from the bed. I stumbled into the bright corridor as they drew the privacy blinds, leaving me standing alone with the sound of the flatline ringing in my ears. I walked out of the hospital, feeling entirely hollow. Yet my mind was moving with cold, terrible clarity. I sat in the driver's seat of my truck in the night wind, gripping the steering wheel until my knuckles went white. Prescott's partners, a clean name, the soil, the fragments locked together with a sickening click. My son's commercial real estate development firm was not a legitimate business. It was a front carefully constructed and deliberately maintained. I thought back to his desperate financial collapse 6 months ago, followed without explanation by his sudden miraculous recovery. He had partnered with a violent criminal syndicate. They were laundering dirty money through large construction projects and needed a spotless, respectable name to anchor the entire operation. They needed the name of a retired civil engineer with 4 decades of unblemished civic service. They needed my name. A memory surfaced sharp and vivid and nauseating. 2 weeks ago, Prescott had come to my house carrying a thick stack of manila folders. He told me they were routine tax documents tied to my late wife's remaining estate. He had been impatient throughout, hovering over my shoulder, pointing to each signature line. I had trusted my own son without question. I signed the papers without reading the fine print. In doing so, I had unknowingly signed away the legal rights to my property and painted a target directly on my own back. I drove home in absolute silence, radio off my mind mapping every structural weakness in my son's arrogant plan. He genuinely believed he could use me as a human shield, a disposable asset to absorb the legal exposure while he operated in the shadows. He thought I was a tired old man, quietly waiting to be filed away in an assisted living facility. I pulled slowly into my dark driveway, the familiar shadows of the cul-de-sac offering no comfort tonight. I climbed the concrete steps to the front porch and reached into my coat pocket for my keys. but when my hand closed around the cold metal of the doorknob, my blood turned to ice. The heavy oak door was already unlocked. The deadbolt had been fully disengaged. I pushed the door open in silence and stepped into the pitch-black foyer. I held my breath and listened to the heavy quiet of my own home. Then I heard it, deliberate footsteps pressing down on the wooden floorboards directly above my head. The methodical creaking moved along the upstairs hallway, advancing toward the closed door of my private home office. I stood frozen in the dark foyer, my heart hammering a hard, violent rhythm against my ribs. My own son was moving through my empty house like a thief working in the dark. Every instinct I had screamed at me to charge up that staircase, throw the office door open, and demand the truth out of him. I wanted to seize him by the lapels of that expensive tailored suit and shake it all loose. I wanted to ask him why an innocent old man at the local pharmacy was lying in an intensive care unit at that very moment, beaten nearly to death for trying to warn me. But I drove the burning anger down, locked it away behind a wall of cold, calculated steel. 4 decades on volatile construction sites had taught me that acting on raw emotion during a critical structural failure leads to only one outcome: catastrophic collapse. Patience was never just a virtue in my profession. Patience was a survival requirement. I had to stop Prescott, but I could not let him know the web had already been found. I needed to play a very specific role. I glanced down at the small entryway table beside me. Resting near the edge was a heavy ceramic vase that my late wife had purchased during a long-ago trip to the mountains. I drew a slow, steadying breath, reached out my calloused hand, and deliberately knocked the vase off the edge of the table. It struck the hardwood floor with a deafening crash that rang through the silent house like a gunshot. The footsteps above me stopped dead. A heavy, suffocating silence dropped over everything. I let out a loud theatrical groan, shuffled my boots against the floorboards, and called up into the darkness. I asked whether anyone was up there, my voice carefully shaped into the shaky, bewildered tremor of a frightened old man who had no idea what was happening. For several agonizing seconds, nothing. Then the office door clicked. The stairs groaned under a slow, careful weight. Prescott came down into the dim light of the foyer. He was breathing hard, his face flushed and blanched at the same time. His tie hung loose, and a faint sheen of sweat covered his brow. He flinched when he spotted me, standing in the scatter of broken ceramic. He fumbled for a story, stammering that he had not expected me back so soon. He claimed he had left an important fountain pen in my home office during his visit earlier and had just slipped by to retrieve it. He held up empty hands with a weak, unconvincing laugh, adding that he must have left it at his own office after all. I looked straight into his lying eyes. The urge to grab him by the collar and pin him against the wall was almost blinding in its intensity. I thought of the hours I had spent teaching him to ride a bicycle on this very street, the college tuition I had paid without complaint. And here he stood treating me like a foolish obstacle. But my self-control held. I drew on the same disciplined focus I had used designing suspension bridges under deadline. I knew that letting a single crack show in my facade would compromise the entire foundation. I did not challenge the ridiculous pen story. Instead, I let my shoulders sag forward in heavy, exaggerated defeat. I rubbed my eyes with the back of my hand and pushed out a long, weary sigh. I looked at the broken pieces of my late wife's ceramic vase scattered across the floor, then back up at my son. I said in a voice thick with manufactured sorrow that I was simply growing too old and clumsy to manage this house on my own. I let the silence stretch for a moment before setting out precisely the bait I knew he could not resist. I told Prescott softly that perhaps he and Vivian had been right all along. Maybe I really should take a closer look at that luxury home they had shown me. The change in Prescott was immediate and deeply sickening. The sharp, panicked tension drained completely from his shoulders. The tight lines around his mouth relaxed into a broad, victorious smile. He was convinced he had finally broken me. He stepped forward and placed a warm, steadying hand on my shoulder, playing the devoted, concerned son with practiced perfection. He told me it was a very wise decision and that he would personally handle all the paperwork, so I would not need to worry about a single detail. He promised to call me tomorrow to get the ball rolling. With his goal apparently achieved, Prescott excused himself and practically jogged out the front door into the cold autumn night. I stood in the dark foyer and listened as his heavy vehicle backed down the driveway and accelerated away down the street. The moment the sound of his engine faded entirely, my defeated posture evaporated. I stood up straight, my mind shifting in an instant from a fragile old man back to a calculating engineer. I left the broken ceramic where it lay and went directly up the wooden staircase, taking the steps two at a time. I hit the lights in my home office and stood in the center of the room, eyes moving methodically across every detail. I checked the filing cabinets, the desk drawers, and the personal safe. Nothing was missing. Every financial document, every family photograph, every personal record was exactly where I had left it. My son had not come here to take something from me. He had come here to leave something behind. I walked the perimeter of the room, looking for any structural inconsistency. Near the far corner, I found it. My heavy solid oak bookshelf flush against the wall for more than 20 years had shifted. The edge jutted out perhaps a quarter of an inch, casting a thin dark shadow along the baseboard. I gripped the thick wooden frame and pulled the unit away from the wall. I steadied my breath and looked at the floor. Tucked into the narrow hidden space behind the shelving, resting silently on the hardwood, was a thick industrial-grade metal briefcase secured with dual combination locks. I stared down at it while my mind worked through the possibilities. The heavy steel casing and complex locking mechanism pointed to something of enormous value or something enormously dangerous. Every part of me wanted to go to the garage, retrieve a heavy crowbar, and smash the locks off where they stood. I wanted to drag whatever was inside out into the bright light and look at it directly, but decades of engineering experience counseled me sharply against that impulse. If I broke the locks, Prescott would know immediately that his scheme had been exposed. He would pivot, relocate his operation, and likely move to have me declared legally incompetent before I could assemble a single piece of usable evidence. I needed to catch him entirely off guard. I needed him in the act. I carefully pushed the briefcase back into the dark recess behind the shelving unit. I gripped the bookshelf and slid it precisely back into its original position, making sure the alignment was perfect. I rubbed away the faint scuff marks on the floor with the soft sleeve of my flannel shirt, leaving no trace of my presence. The trap had to remain completely undisturbed. I left the house, got into my pickup truck, and deliberately bypassed every hardware and sporting goods store in my immediate neighborhood. The clerks knew my face. Any purchase I made locally could reach the wrong ears. Instead, I drove 45 minutes down the interstate to a large hunting supply store 2 towns over. The place smelled of leather canvas and gun oil. I went straight to the outdoor surveillance aisle and carefully selected 6 military-grade motion-activated trail cameras. I made certain the models I chose carried invisible infrared night vision, high-capacity memory cards, and cellular transmission capability, meaning each camera would push live footage directly and silently to my personal mobile phone. When I set the equipment on the checkout counter, the young cashier asked whether I was after a particularly elusive buck this season. I gave him the tired, easy smile of a harmless old hunter. I told him I was trying to catch a destructive predator that had been slipping onto my property under cover of darkness. I paid cash to avoid any digital footprint, loaded the heavy shopping bags into the car, and drove back to my quiet suburban street as the cold autumn sun dropped toward the horizon. By the time I pulled into the driveway, the sky had bruised to deep purple and charcoal. I hauled the bag straight through to the backyard. The sharp autumn wind tore fiercely through the bare branches, rattling the dense canopy of ancient oaks that ringed my property. I unpacked the sleek camouflage-painted cameras and buckled the heavy utility belt around my waist. Gazing up at the tallest oak nearest the unraked leaf pile, a sudden jolt of sharp pain fired through my lower back. 70 years old, and my joints loudly protested even the thought of climbing. But the moment my hands closed around the lowest thick branch and I hauled my weight upward, something old and deeply buried took over. Long before I was a civil engineer, I was a young infantryman serving in the military. My body pulled the memory up, without being asked the hard discipline of combat training, the strict art of moving silently through hostile ground, the raw willpower needed to push past physical pain. I climbed into the dark canopy, rough bark grinding against my calloused palms. When I reached the right vantage point, a memory struck me like something physical. I was 30 years younger, standing in this very oak on a bright Saturday afternoon, reaching a strong hand down to pull a laughing, gap-toothed little boy up onto the branches. Hours spent teaching a young Prescott where to find the safest footholds, how to shift his weight, how to stop being afraid of the height. I had looked at that innocent, joyful child with a pride that felt almost too large to hold. Now, decades on, I was hanging in freezing darkness in those same branches, carefully mounting covert surveillance equipment to catch that same boy committing serious federal crimes. The contrast between the child I had raised and the man he had become pressed the air from my lungs. I swallowed the grief heavy and bitter and turned my full attention to the grim work ahead. I locked the first trail camera firmly against the trunk, aiming its infrared lens directly at the unraked leaf pile where Prescott and Vivienne had been pointing earlier that day. I activated the cellular feed and checked the crisp night vision image on my phone screen. Then I moved tree to tree, enduring the burning ache in my knees, hips, and shoulders, until all 6 cameras were set to cover every possible angle of the excavation site. The entire backyard had become an inescapable surveillance net. I finally descended the last tree, my boots landing on the soft, damp grass with a quiet, solid thud. I brushed loose dirt from my jacket, feeling something cold and grim settle in my chest, the dark satisfaction of a trap fully laid. I turned toward the house, ready to rest my worn-out body. But with my very first step toward the back patio, a blinding flood of light shattered the quiet darkness. The powerful motion sensor floodlight mounted above the front driveway had triggered. I froze, my heart lurching into my throat. The sudden glare threw long, jagged shadows across the brick face of my house. I pressed close to the wall, keeping to the dark edge of the yard, and eased my head around the corner to look at the driveway. A massive jet-black SUV with heavily tinted windows was rolling to a slow, near-silent stop directly in front of my property. It was not Prescott's vehicle. This truck was unmarked, aggressively large, and carried a menace that the harsh artificial light only sharpened. The engine rumbled at a low, dangerous frequency that seemed to travel through the cold ground and up under the soles of my boots. I stood motionless in the freezing shadows, my breath rising in small white clouds, watching the unfamiliar vehicle idle just beyond my front lawn. My grip tightened on the rough brick edge. The storm I had been bracing for had arrived far sooner than I had anticipated. I pressed my back flat against the freezing exterior wall. That deep vibration moved through the soil and into my feet like a warning. I couldn't stay exposed in the side yard. If the floodlight caught even the edge of my shadow, the surveillance net I had just spent hours building would be worthless. I moved with agonizing patience, sliding each boot across the damp grass and planting every step with absolute care to avoid snapping a twig. I slipped through the wooden gate, eased it shut behind me, and gently pushed the back door open. Inside, I pulled the oak door closed until the deadbolt clicked. I stood in the dark kitchen chest, heaving, forcing my breathing to slow and quiet. Working from memory, I moved through the unlit living room and crouched low behind the heavy velvet drapes flanking the front bay window. I parted the fabric just a sliver, giving myself a concealed line of sight to the driveway. The floodlight blazed in the cold dark, throwing the massive vehicle into sharp relief just beyond my brick mailbox. Both passenger doors swung open at the same moment with a synchronized click. 2 men stepped out into the night air, and my instincts cataloged them immediately as threats. They bore no resemblance to friendly developers or city zoning officials making a routine pass through the neighborhood. Both wore sharp, expensive dark suits that looked jarringly wrong on my quiet suburban cul-de-sac. They moved with a calculated, rigid efficiency that sent a cold warning straight down my spine. The taller one casually straightened his jacket, his eyes making a slow, professional sweep of my property with the detachment of a man who does this routinely. The shorter, heavier one drew a sleek digital camera from his inner pocket and began photographing the front yard in a deliberate, systematic sequence. Roofline angles the gap between the exterior brick walls and the neighboring fences the width of the driveway approach. This was not admiration for the architecture. They were mapping the tactical boundaries of a secure operational zone, measuring access points, plotting escape routes, checking sight lines from the street to confirm adequate privacy. The taller man reached into his jacket and produced a large smartphone. He raised it to his face and initiated a live video call. The screen's glow caught the hard planes of his features. He slowly rotated the phone, using the rear camera to walk whoever was on the other end through the real-time layout of my property. He panned deliberately down the full length of the driveway, swinging the lens toward the wooden gate that closed off the backyard, shifting his wide stance on my front walkway. The angle of that glowing screen drifted squarely into my narrow line of sight through the bay window. Even from my position inside the darkened house, the face on that screen was unmistakable. My own son. Prescott filled the frame completely, his expression drawn tight with nervous, greedy anticipation, sitting safely inside his comfortable home office, entirely insulated from the dangerous work being conducted on my front lawn. He was directing them. I watched in stunned, silent horror as Prescott raised his finger on the screen and gestured emphatically toward the dark side yard that led to the unraked leaves. A wave of cold clarity broke over me. The dying words of Mr. Huxley rang through the quiet room. Prescott's partners, a clean name the soil. The full scale of it finally opened up before me. This was not a desperate son grasping at a family inheritance. This was a deeply organized, well-entrenched, and genuinely violent criminal enterprise operating on a massive scale. Prescott had sold himself to climb out of financial ruin. His investors were ruthless men who needed untraceable ground in which to bury their darkest secrets. They needed quiet residential properties legally held by upstanding citizens with clean records, no criminal entanglements of any kind. My unblemished reputation as a career civil engineer made my home the ideal cover for their operation. Prescott had deliberately steered me into signing those dense legal documents weeks earlier, transferring power of attorney, so he could hand these men free, unrestricted access to my land. He had knowingly offered his childhood home as a dumping ground for a violent syndicate. The sheer weight of that betrayal was almost too much to carry. He was prepared to sacrifice my quiet life, my spotless name, and my safety to prop up his hollow pretense of manufactured wealth. The two men finished photographing the front of the house and moved with purpose toward the wooden side gate. I tracked every step through the narrow gap in the velvet drapes, my aging muscles coiled and ready. They made no attempt to force the gate, almost certainly, because Prescott had told them it was locked from the inside. Instead, they leaned over the top of the wooden slats and peered into the pitch-black expanse of my backyard. The taller man held the smartphone up above his head, giving Prescott a live digital view of the dark grounds. The heavy-set man produced a flashlight and drove its beam straight into the darkness. That harsh white light cut through the shadows and landed squarely on the large pile of dead autumn leaves near the back fence, the exact spot I had just spent hours surrounding with hidden trail cameras. The shorter man swung a leg over the lower section of the fence and kicked hard at the outer edge of the leaf pile. The brittle leaves exploded into the cold wind, uncovering what had been deliberately concealed beneath them. It was not normal settled garden soil. It was freshly disturbed, loosely turned black earth. The man pulled his leg back and faced his partner. He offered a slow, deeply sinister smile and raised his thumb in plain confirmation toward Prescott on the video screen. The call cut off. The two men turned without a word, climbed back into the black SUV, and the vehicle glided smoothly down the street and vanished into the night. I held my crouch behind the drape's eyes fixed on the spot where they had stood. The puzzle had resolved itself with terrible clarity. I now knew precisely where Ground Zero was. I remained motionless in the darkened living room until the SUV's rumble faded away completely. The immediate danger had passed, but I could not spend the night in this compromised house. I needed a very specific kind of help, the kind that does not come through standard legal channels. I needed someone who worked comfortably in the gray margins of criminal investigations. I gathered my keys and slipped out the back door, cutting through the narrow alleyway to steer clear of any lingering surveillance. I walked at a quick pace under the dim glow of the street lamps for 4 blocks until I reached my truck, which I had parked there deliberately. I got in, turned the engine over, and eased out onto the empty highway. My destination was a 24-hour diner on the far edge of the county line. The drive took 40 agonizing minutes, every mile shadowed by the image of Mr. Huxley lying broken in that sterile hospital bed. When I finally swung into the cracked asphalt parking lot, the red diner sign buzzed with a low electric hum. I pushed through the heavy glass door into the smell of stale coffee, swept the empty room, and found him right away tucked into a corner booth with his back against the wall. Corbett was a trusted old fishing companion, but long before we ever shared a quiet boat on the lake together, he had been a highly decorated forensic accountant for the Federal Bureau of Investigation. He had spent 30 hard years methodically dismantling organized crime operations by following the hidden money. A man of very few words with a mind like a steel trap. I slid into the worn vinyl seat across from him. No warm greeting, no smile. He simply pushed a steaming mug of black coffee across the table and waited. I drew a slow breath and laid the whole thing out, keeping my voice low and my emotions locked down tight. the same disciplined focus I had drawn on while engineering major bridges for 40 years. I walked him through every piece in order: the panicked warning at the local pharmacy, the topological scan hidden in Prescott's coffee cup, the brutal attack on the old man's, the heavy metal briefcase concealed in my office, and the two men who had just walked my backyard like they already owned it. Corbett listened without a single interruption. His eyes stayed fixed on my face the entire time, processing the cascade of information with the cool detachment of long professional practice. When I finished, the silence between us settled in like something physical. He reached into his worn leather satchel, drew out an encrypted laptop, flipped it open, and his thick fingers moved swiftly across the keys, cutting through security firewalls, reaching into restricted federal databases. The cold blue glow of the screen reflected off his glasses as he ran a silent, thorough background check on my son's commercial real estate firm. I sat still and watched the grim focus settle across his weathered face. For 10 agonizing minutes, the only sounds were the soft clatter of his typing and the distant drone of the kitchen exhaust fan. Then Corbett stopped. He exhaled heavily, pulled off his glasses, and pressed his fingers against the bridge of his nose. He met my eyes with a look of measured sympathy. Just above a whisper, he told me the situation was considerably worse than I had calculated. Prescott's real estate company had been flagged by federal monitors for over 8 months. The firm was not a legitimate business. It was a sophisticated, high-volume front built to launder enormous sums of illegal cash for a notoriously violent overseas syndicate. Corbett laid out the mechanics. The syndicate funneled dirty money into Prescott's firm through fictitious construction contracts and phantom development projects. Prescott would then purchase legitimate materials and cycle the funds through the American real estate market, cleaning them in the process. But the operation had recently shifted. The syndicate now needed secure, completely off-grid locations to temporarily bury large shipments of untraceable physical currency and illegal contraband. They required ordinary residential properties held by people with spotless histories to serve as temporary holding vaults. My decades-long reputation as a decorated civil engineer had made my home the most natural, unsuspicious target imaginable. The full reality of my son's betrayal pressed the air from my chest. Prescott had deliberately placed his own father in front of his criminal handlers as a human shield. I stared into my cold coffee, the dark surface mirroring the devastation I couldn't speak aloud. I asked Corbett whether there was any realistic way to secure the property against heavy excavation equipment while we assembled enough solid evidence to bring federal authorities in safely. I floated the idea of an emergency restraining order or a temporary legal freeze on any structural changes to the deed. Corbett didn't answer right away. His eyes dropped back to the laptop screen and his fingers moved across the keys again, pulling up the publicly accessible county property records for my address. He wanted to confirm whether Prescott had been reckless enough to file any preliminary excavation permits in my name. As the document loaded, the color drained from Corbett's face. He leaned forward sharply toward the screen, as though the legal text in front of him refused to register. He slowly turned the laptop and slid it across the table until the screen faced me. I put on my reading glasses and leaned in. It was the official county deed to my home, the same house I had built with my own hands 40 years ago, the house where my late wife and I had raised our family. But the name on the ownership line was no longer mine. According to the legally binding document on that screen, the property had been officially transferred exactly 3 days ago. The new legal owner was a faceless, untraceable corporate shell company connected to Prescott's development firm. My mind went straight back to the afternoon. Prescott had shown up at my door a few weeks earlier, pressing a thick stack of papers on me, insisting they were routine tax forms needed to close out the remaining details of my late wife's estate. He had been impatient, almost aggressive, pointing to exactly where I needed to sign, and I had trusted him without question. What I was about to discover that night wasn't just a shock. It was the kind of blow that reorders everything you thought you knew about the person closest to you. Before I get there, tell me this. If you ever suspected someone you loved was quietly working against you, would you confront them face to face, or would you stay silent and build your case first? I had signed those documents without a second look. That single act of blind trust had handed him full, unrestricted power of attorney. He had turned my own signature into a weapon and used it to strip the property right out from under me. I sat motionless in the diner booth, staring at the glowing screen. The men in the black SUV had not been trespassing on my land tonight. In the eyes of the law, they were standing on their own property. I no longer held title to the home I had built. I was by every legal measure homeless. The overhead lights hummed as the full weight of it settled over me. The deed on Corbett's laptop confirmed that my own son had methodically erased my name from everything I had spent a lifetime building. 40 years of sweat poured into that soil, and he had legally evicted me without ever looking me in the eye. Corbett watched me with quiet, steady sympathy, the look of a man who understood betrayal at a cellular level. He closed the laptop with a firm snap that rang out like a period at the end of a sentence. He asked what my next move would be. The shock drained out of me, and something cold and deliberate filled the space it left behind. I told him I intended to give Prescott exactly what he was after: an empty house. I drew my phone from my jacket pocket, my calloused hands perfectly steady. I stepped out of the diner into the biting autumn air. I dialed Prescott's number, consciously rebuilding the mask of the worn-out, defeated old man he needed me to be. He picked up on the second ring, his voice wound tight with barely concealed anxiety. I exhaled slowly, loading the sound with every ounce of manufactured exhaustion I could summon. I told him with a carefully measured tremor that the weight of the last several days had finally broken through. I gave him total surrender. I said the upkeep of the property had become too much for my tired body, and I was prepared to sign the admission papers for Birchwood Pines Manor. He buried his surging excitement beneath a thin layer of performed concern. I pressed on, telling him I needed a day or two to clear my head before such a major change. I said I was loading up my gear and heading to Moosehead Lakes for a 2-day fishing trip, a quiet chance to make peace with leaving my independent life behind. The bait was in the water, and Prescott took it without hesitation. He smoothly assured me I shouldn't worry about a single thing while I was gone. He volunteered eagerly to stop by, check the locks, and keep watch over the house. I thanked him with the full warmth of a grateful, helpless father and ended the call. I drove back to my stolen house to collect my fishing gear. Walking through the front door felt entirely different this time. The walls I had painted, the hardwood floors I had laid the living room, where my late wife used to settle in with her evening novels. It all felt like a stage set dressed for someone else's story. I went to the garage and pulled my heavy canvas duffel from the high shelf. As I worked through the familiar motions, loading the tackle box, the waterproof boots, the insulated jacket, the sting of betrayal rolled back over me, fresh. Prescott was not simply taking my property and my financial footing. He was nudging me toward an early end, rushing me into a facility where my independence would slowly dissolve so he could hand my home to criminals. He was converting my sanctuary into a burial ground for their darkest dealings. Every zipper I pulled, every buckle I snapped, built another layer of cold resolve around whatever warmth was left in me. I was no longer an aging father trying to reach a wayward son. I was a civil engineer with 4 decades of experience methodically identifying a critical structural failure before it brought everything down. I shouldered the heavy bag and walked out of the garage without breaking stride. I didn't glance back at the dark windows or the empty porch. I locked the front door, fully aware that the key in my hand was legally meaningless. I got into the truck, started the engine, and rolled slowly back down the driveway. I made a deliberate show of taking the northbound interstate ramp, giving anyone watching from the shadows a convincing picture of a man leaving town for the weekend. I drove north for exactly 15 miles, moving easily with the thin, late-night traffic. When I was certain no unmarked vehicle had followed, I took a sharp exit and wound through a series of back roads, looping south toward the industrial edge of the county. I pulled up finally at an isolated, long-abandoned manufacturing park. Behind a massive, decaying warehouse tucked well out of sight was Corbett's private garage and command center. The corrugated metal door rose with a quiet mechanical hum as I approached. I drove in and disappeared from the world. The door rolled shut behind me. The inside of the garage had been completely converted into a tactical operations hub. Heavy blackout curtains sealed the high windows. A bank of high-resolution monitors blazed against the cold cinder block walls, washing the space in sharp blue light. Corbett was already at the large folding table, threading his encrypted network routers together and arranging a cluster of digital servers. I pulled a metal chair alongside him and set my phone on the table. I synced it to his master terminal and routed the live video feeds from the 6 military-grade trail cameras hidden in my backyard oaks directly to his screens. The wireless signal locked in quickly and the monitors blinked to life. The infrared lenses delivered crisp, high-contrast black and white images of my dark, empty backyard. A cold wind moved through the bare branches, dragging ghostly shadows across the thick mat of fallen leaves below. We sat in that cold garage with lukewarm coffee and foam cups, waiting in the disciplined, absolute silence of men who had learned patience the hard way. The digital clock in the corner of the primary screen counted forward without mercy. 11 o'clock came and went without a stir. 11:30 the same. The tension in the room had a physical weight to it, dense enough that you could almost press your hand against it. My eyes burned steadily from the monitor glare as I held my watch on the feeds. My mind moved through the pieces. The terrified old man lying in that hospital bed. The architectural scan rolled into a coffee cup. The cold, measured smile on Vivian's face when she told me I could easily slip and fall and nobody would ever know. Every fragment had found its place in the pattern. The stage was set. The clock turned to exactly midnight. A sharp alert chimed from the central terminal. The motion sensor on the northernmost oak camera had triggered. I came forward in my chair, fingers gripping the edge of the metal table. On the main screen, the infrared feed jolted as the heavy wooden gate at the far end of my property swung open hard. Two brilliant headlight beams cut across the black and white image, sweeping long arcs over the damp grass. A massive excavation vehicle ground slowly into my backyard. It groaned to a stop just inside the fence line, its tires tearing into the lawn. In the cold glow of Corbett's hidden garage, we pressed close to the monitors. The infrared cameras rendered everything in unsparing detail. The vehicle was an oversized tactical transport truck. The engine died, dropping my backyard into total silence. All four doors opened at once. Prescott and Vivienne climbed out into the freezing night, followed immediately by the same two broad-shouldered men I had watched from behind the drapes. They went straight to the rear of the truck and threw the cargo doors open. Out came four reinforced steel shovels and a pair of pickaxes hand tools deliberately chosen to avoid waking the neighbors. They moved quickly through the gate boots, grinding through the brown leaves. Corbett leaned in and tapped a sequence on his keyboard. The audio feed came online, pushing sound through the external speakers. Wind-rustling branches, the crunch of footsteps filled the command center. They walked directly toward the large pile of unraked leaves along the back boundary of the property. The taller man kicked the remaining leaves aside in a single violent sweep, fully exposing the loose, recently disturbed soil beneath. Prescott stood at the edge of the excavation zone, gripping his shovel with an uncertain posture. His eyes moved nervously toward the dark windows of my empty house, clearly not entirely sold on his own story about the fishing trip. He dragged the back of his hand across a bead of sweat on his forehead, visibly trembling. Then, a voice guessed through the audio feed, sharp, commanding, stripped of anything resembling warmth. It was Vivienne. The patronizing tone she always kept in reserve for me was completely gone. Her voice carried pure venom. She snapped at Prescott to stop gawking at the dark house and get his shovel in the ground. The syndicate was running to a tight schedule and had no patience for his cowardice. I sat completely still, eyes on the monitor struck cold by the transformation. The soft, considerate daughter-in-law, who had laid her hand gently over mine at the dinner table, was a fiction from start to finish. The woman issuing hard, merciless orders at my son was a seasoned operative. She had been steering his reckless schemes all along. She was the syndicate's liaison, and she held his leash with a firm grip. Prescott protested weakly, complaining that the earth was packed solid and his hands were already raw from the cold steel of the shovel handle. Vivienne moved into his space, her face inches from his. The camera caught the contempt written across her features without flattery. She tore into him a weak, pathetic excuse for a man, she said. She reminded him that his financial wreckage had nearly gotten them both killed 6 months ago, and that this excavation was the sole reason the syndicate had let him continue breathing. She told him to dig until his hands bled, because he owed his miserable life to the dirt beneath his feet. Prescott visibly caved beneath the assault. He swallowed hard. The polished businessman he performed in the public stripped completely away. He was a frightened pawn. He drove his shovel into the dark earth. Corbett and I watched without a word as the three men ripped into the soil of my backyard. The infrared feed caught the heat rising off their bodies as they worked. Dark mounds of earth built up quickly around the edges of the growing trench. The labor was brutal. Prescott was gasping, chest heaving, but he did not dare slow down under Vivienne's unwavering surveillance. She circled the deepening hole like a prison warden, arms folded hard across her chest, eyes dropping repeatedly to the lit face of her expensive wristwatch. The minutes ground forward. The hole grew wider and deeper, surpassing 5 ft in depth. Anger rose steadily in my chest. This quiet ground where my late wife had lovingly planted azaleas was being torn apart by criminals. I kept my breathing measured and slow. Then a sharp metallic clank rang through the audio speakers, the unmistakable crack of steel hitting solid metal cutting across the rhythmic scrape of shovels. Both men stopped instantly. Prescott dropped his shovel and buckled to his knees at the muddy edge of the trench chest, heaving smearing wet mud across his pale forehead. Vivienne leaned eagerly over the edge, a triumphant smile pulling at her face. She ordered the men to bring them up, carefully reminding them the contents were worth more than all of their lives combined. The two broad-shouldered men dropped into the hole boots, sinking into the wet mud. They grunted under the effort, seizing the heavy reinforced nylon straps buried in the loose earth. With a coordinated heave, they wrenched a massive object free and dropped it up onto the grass. It landed hard, a large military duffel bag sealed with heavy steel padlocks. They reached back into the darkness and hauled up a second identical bag, letting it fall with a heavy thud alongside the first. Then a third dragged up and dropped onto the torn lawn beside the others. 3 massive duffel bags in a row, radiating a cold and undeniable menace. I had no doubt whatsoever that those bags were packed with millions of dollars in illicit currency and illegal contraband. The syndicate was pulling their buried cash out of the ground. They were successfully reclaiming their hidden stash from my stolen property. Corbett let out a long, quiet exhale beside me, saying we finally had everything we needed. Once they loaded those bags into the truck, he said he would call his federal contacts. A wave of relief moved through my exhausted body. The trap had held. We had them cold. But as I kept my eyes on the monitors, waiting for the men to carry the bags toward their vehicle, that relief evaporated without warning. They were not leaving. The 2 men climbed out of the muddy trench and stood beside the retrieved bags in silence. Vivienne turned her cold, calculating eyes toward Prescott, who was still on his knees in the damp, dirt-sucking air. She gave him a short, deliberate nod. Prescott pulled himself to his feet. He reached inside his ruined suit jacket and produced a thick, tightly bound stack of pristine white documents sealed in transparent plastic. He stood at the muddy edge of the trench, staring down into the black, empty hole. He raised his arms and let the bundle fall. It dropped through the cold air and landed with a dull thud against the wet floor of the trench. Through the high-definition audio feed coming into Corbett's concealed garage, every sound arrived with terrible clarity. I sat rigid in my metal chair, eyes fixed on the glowing screen, watching my son stand over the muddy pit he had just dug in the yard where he once played as a child. The taller syndicate man stepped forward and aimed his flashlight down into the hole. The beam found the plastic-wrapped package resting in the dark earth. He turned his gaze on Prescott, his voice a low, dangerous rumble through the speakers. He demanded to know exactly what Prescott had just thrown into the trench. He reminded my son that their instructions were strictly to retrieve the $5 million in currency, packed inside the duffel bags, not to leave anything behind. Prescott raised both hands in a settling gesture, working to keep the situation under control. His voice trembled at the edges, but a sickening current of arrogant pride ran underneath it. He told the operative to relax, insisting that the buried documents were the key to keeping every one of them out of federal prison. He pointed down at the trench, stating he had spent the last 6 months constructing a foolproof contingency for their entire money-laundering operation. Vivienne stepped forward out of the shadows, wrapping her arms around herself against the biting cold. She offered the syndicate men a wicked conspiratorial smile and told them to listen very carefully to her husband. It was a brilliant plan that would guarantee their total immunity. Prescott cleared his throat, drawing himself up with a grim surge of confidence. He laid out his treacherous scheme in explicit detail, each word landing in the quiet command center like a physical strike. The plastic bundle, he explained, contained meticulously prepared, extensively forged financial ledgers. Those ledgers documented every ghost construction contract, every shell corporation, and every illicit transaction the syndicate had run over the past year. But here was the key, he said with a dark chuckle. Not one of those ledgers bore his name or Vivienne's, or the name of any active syndicate member. Instead, Prescott proudly confessed he had spent countless hours forging my signature across every single page. He had anchored the entire criminal enterprise to my spotless professional record as a civil engineer. My unblemished reputation, he told them, was the ultimate cover. a fabricated paper trail designed to look like the tragic unraveling of a highly respected old man running a shadow empire from his suburban home. The shorter syndicate man stood with his thick arms crossed, listening carefully as Prescott walked through the timeline of my planned destruction. Prescott laid it out with obvious relish. By tomorrow afternoon, he said he would have me signing the permanent admission papers for Birchwood Pines Manor. I was already broken, he told them, a tired old man practically begging to be put away. Once I was safely institutionalized and cleared from the property, his master stroke would begin. He would use an untraceable burner phone to place an anonymous tip directly to the Federal Bureau of Investigation, pointing their agent straight to this address with instructions to dig near the loose soil by the back fence. Vivienne cut in, her voice laced with cruel amusement. She cheerfully added that the authorities would pull up the forged ledgers alongside trace amounts of the physical currency they were extracting tonight. A watertight case against a retired engineer who had allegedly let greed consume him. She let out a sharp laugh that rang through the garage, predicting the strain of a federal indictment would likely stop my fragile heart before I ever set foot in a courtroom. Prescott nodded along with obvious enthusiasm. He assured the dangerous men that I would inevitably absorb the full weight of the laundering operation, federally indicted, utterly destroyed, dying in a cold prison cell with all their darkest secrets locked inside me. In exchange, Prescott and Vivienne would legally inherit my untarnished real estate holdings, insulated from the federal fallout, while the syndicate walked away spotless and free to build their next lucrative front elsewhere. The taller syndicate man held his gaze on Prescott for a long, silent beat. The infrared camera caught the slight nod of approval he finally offered. He gave a gruff compliment on the plan's ruthless efficiency, saying he had never taken Prescott for a man with the stomach to sacrifice his own father. Prescott responded with a casual shrug in the cold night air, dismissing my existence with a wave of his hand. Business was business, he said, and I had already outlived any practical use to him. They grabbed the 3 duffel bags and hauled the $5 million across my ruined lawn, loading them into the back of the black SUV and slamming the cargo doors. Prescott and Vivienne snatched up their shovels and raked loose dirt over the plastic-wrapped ledgers, burying the fabricated evidence before retreating to their vehicle. Within minutes, the driveway sat empty. The motion sensor light clicked off, dropping my home back into darkness, leaving behind a perfectly constructed trap designed to end my life. Inside the isolated command center, the sudden quiet was suffocating. I sat frozen in my metal chair, staring at the dark monitors. The black coffee in my cup had gone cold. Beside me, Corbett slowly took off his glasses and let out a heavy breath. He made no attempt at hollow comfort. He knew precisely what I had just witnessed. He knew I had sat there and watched my only son casually sign my death warrant. The deep, crushing sadness that had briefly threatened to break me disappeared entirely. Whatever desperate hope I had clung to that, Prescott was simply a misguided child dissolved into the cold air of that concrete space. He was not a victim of circumstance. He was not being coerced. He was the deliberate, calculating architect of my destruction. He had engineered a structural nightmare designed to bring the full weight of it down on me with no way out. I closed my eyes and drew a slow, measured breath. My mind went to the great steel suspension bridges I had built across my career. I thought about the precision required to hold thousands of tons of concrete steady against hurricane-force winds. I recalled the calculations needed to safely demolish a failing structure without taking down what stood beside it. My son had badly miscalculated. He genuinely believed I was a weak foundation that would buckle under manufactured pressure. He had failed entirely to account for the fact that I held the blueprints to dismantle his operation down to bare ground. When I opened my eyes, the grief had been replaced by cold resolution. I turned to Corbett, my voice flat and stripped of sentiment. I told him it was time to drop the bridge. Corbett neither hesitated nor asked what I meant. He understood the weight of those words and the absolute finality behind them. He reached across the folding table and drew a heavily encrypted satellite phone from his worn leather satchel. He bypassed the standard cellular networks, entirely dialing a direct unlisted line that connected straight to former colleagues still active in the Federal Financial Crimes Division. When the call connected, Corbett delivered the situation with crisp military precision. He reported a confirmed high-level money laundering extraction currently in progress at a residential target. He detailed the $5 million in illicit physical currency, the syndicate operatives on scene, and the active burial of deeply forged federal evidence laying out everything needed to establish the undeniable urgency of an immediate raid. Corbett then routed our live high-definition infrared camera feed directly to the Federal Operations Center in downtown Portland. The volume and quality of the evidence streaming across their secure screens produced an instantaneous response. A specialized tactical strike team, already on night standby, was mobilized within minutes. Corbett ended the call and eased the encrypted laptop shut. He turned his weathered face toward me, his expression carrying the grim solemnity of a man who has seen how these nights end. He told me to stay inside the reinforced walls of his command center. The federal raid, he warned, would be chaotic, dangerous, and fast. He nearly pleaded with me not to put my aging heart through the trauma of watching my only son hauled away in steel handcuffs. I held his gaze, my voice steady, and beyond any hesitation. I was not going to hide in the shadows while my stolen house was taken apart around me. I told Corbett that Prescott had carefully designed a plan to frame me for federal crimes and leave me rotting in a prison cell for whatever years I had left. I needed to be standing on my own property when the trap finally closed. I needed to look Prescott in the eye at the precise moment he understood that his carefully built empire had come apart at every joint. Corbett studied my face for a long moment, reading the unbreakable resolve of a father who had nothing left to protect except his name. He gave a single nod, picked up his keys from the table, and walked out to his unmarked vehicle. The drive back toward my suburban neighborhood passed in heavy, suffocating silence. The cold autumn dark slid past the passenger window in a steady blur. I kept my eyes on the illuminated dashboard, letting the engine's rhythm hold my thoughts in place. As we moved down the empty highway, a deep and genuine mourning finally settled over me. Not for the property, not for the financial betrayal. I was mourning the boy I had raised. I saw a young Prescott racing through the backyard sprinklers, his face lit up with pure, uncomplicated joy. I remembered teaching him to ride his first bicycle, how to bait a hook properly, how to knot a Windsor tie before his high school graduation. I had given him everything I had, my discipline, my love, my hard-earned understanding of the world. But the truth was unsparing. That boy was gone. He had been consumed completely by something cold and hungry, replaced by a man who looked at his own father and saw nothing but a disposable piece in a criminal arrangement. The grief of that was sharp and real, but it also brought a strange, clarifying stillness. I was no longer reaching back, trying to salvage a son from his worst choices. I was moving forward to neutralize a serious threat to my own survival. Protecting what remained of my life and legacy meant letting go of every last paternal instinct for good. I locked the untainted memories of who he once was into a sealed corner of my mind. The man who had buried forged documents in my backyard was a ruthless criminal, and he needed to face justice tonight. Corbett cut the headlights 3 blocks from my quiet street, gliding the vehicle silently to a stop near the corner of the neighborhood park. The tactical federal response was already taking shape in the darkness around us. Unmarked black vans and armored tactical vehicles sat at every intersection, sealing off every viable exit from my residential cul-de-sac. Federal agents in dark specialized gear moved through the neighboring yards with terrifying speed and absolute silence. Corbett presented his retired federal credentials to a perimeter guard, and we were waved through to the mobile command unit parked behind a dense row of evergreens. We stepped inside the cramped, glowing interior of the surveillance van, surrounded by agents tracking the live feeds from my trail cameras. On the primary screen, the scene in my backyard was approaching its final moment. The massive hole in the dark earth was nearly filled. Prescott stood at the edge of the muddy trench, pressing the flat back of his heavy steel shovel against the damp soil, packing it down over the buried forged ledgers. He was breathing hard, his expensive suit wrecked by mud and effort. The 2 syndicate operatives had already loaded the 3 heavy duffel bags into the rear cargo hold of their idling truck. They lingered near the open tailgate posture, relaxed, convinced they had pulled their illicit fortune free without tripping a single alarm. Vivian stood close to Prescott, arms folded across her chest, with cool confidence watching him finish his grim work. The biting wind drove her hair across her face, but she didn't flinch. She simply observed as the earth consumed the final piece of their treacherous puzzle. Prescott flung his muddy shovel aside, letting it clatter hard against the wooden fence. He dragged the back of a trembling hand across his dirty forehead and turned to face his wife. A long, shuddering exhale escaped him, a visible wave of relief softening his taut features. He flashed Vivienne a wide, sickening grin of triumph, utterly certain he had sealed his flawless escape and finished dismantling my life for good. He stretched his hand out toward her, ready to toast their perfect crime. Then the still darkness of that quiet backyard was torn apart without a breath of warning. A dozen blinding high-intensity tactical floodlights erupted simultaneously from every conceivable angle, flooding the entire yard, with the brutal, inescapable brilliance of noonday sun freezing the criminals where they stood in the churned mud. The deafening crack of a digital megaphone split the frozen night air. FBI dropped the shovels. Put your hands in the air. The thundering command bounced off the brick walls of my home. A home no longer mine, but one about to serve as the perfect stage for my son's ultimate downfall. Heavily armored tactical agents swarmed the perimeter with terrifying synchronized precision. They poured over the wooden fence line and spilled from the dark side yards. Assault rifles raised laser sights, slicing sharp red lines through the muddy blackness. The two broad-shouldered syndicate operatives didn't bother attempting any resistance. They were seasoned career criminals who instantly recognized the crushing gap in tactical force. They let their heavy steel pickaxes drop into the wet grass and raised their empty hands, slowly lacing their fingers behind their heads as they sank to their knees in the mud. They knew the drill cold. They accepted capture with a flat professional resignation. There was no outrunning this coordinated federal strike team tonight. Prescott, though, came completely apart. The tactical floodlights blazed across his face, and what they revealed was pure abject terror. He stumbled backward, muddy boots skating on the slick, torn grass near the edge of the deep trench. The heavy shovel slipped from his shaking grip and hit the ground with a dull thud. The polished facade of arrogant superiority crumbled on the spot, and the pathetic, desperate coward beneath it stepped into the light. As the federal agents closed in, shouting continuous orders to freeze, Prescott's survival instinct took over, an instinct built entirely on deflection and treachery. He threw his hands skyward and launched into a frantic torrent of hysterical lies aimed at the approaching officers. His voice cracked with high-pitched panic as a muddy finger jabbed desperately toward the dark silhouette of my house. "Wait, you have to listen to me!" he screamed, words tumbling out in a rapid, pathetic rush. "It's my dad's property. I swear to God I didn't know this was here. My dad forced us to dig it up." He was executing his meticulously crafted fallback plan in real time, trying to frame me directly in front of the federal strike team. He kept up the frantic monologue, jabbing a finger down into the dark hole. "Look at the ledgers. The ledgers have his signature. He is the one running this. He is a crazy old man, and he made me do it." Every word he screamed drove another nail into the coffin of whatever remained between us. He was perfectly willing to send me to a federal penitentiary for the rest of my life, if it bought him a way out of the consequences of his own greed. He actually believed those wild lies would hold. I stepped slowly out from the concealed shadow of the heavy wooden side gate. Corbett walked silently at my side, his federal credentials displayed prominently on his outer jacket. The armed tactical agents recognized him immediately and parted smoothly, opening a clear, unobstructed path directly into the center of my ruined backyard. The blinding lights threw long, sharp shadows across the mud. I didn't hurry. I walked with the slow, measured pace of a man who had fully reclaimed what had been stolen from him. I felt the wet grass compress under the heavy soles of my boots. I paid no attention to the armored federal officers working to secure the outer perimeter of the crime scene. Every bit of my focus was locked on the trembling figure standing at the muddy lip of that freshly dug trench. I stepped into the harsh, glowing circle of the tactical floodlights and went still, letting my presence register fully. I stood directly in front of my son. Prescott stopped screaming mid-sentence. The hysterical pleas died in his throat. His wide, frantic eyes found my face, and what remained of his color drained away entirely. He went chalk white, a man staring at something that shouldn't exist. A ghost stepping out of a grave he thought was sealed. His jaw worked open and shut without producing a sound, struggling to process the impossible reality before him. He had calculated every variable of his treacherous plan with meticulous care, everyone except for this. He had assumed I was safely miles away, obediently packing for a miserable stretch in a nursing home. He never once imagined that the clueless old man he held in such contempt had been the architect of this entire federal sting. I looked straight into his terrified eyes and offered him nothing, no anger, no grief, not a trace of paternal warmth. The bond that had tied me to him across decades was gone, cut clean. I no longer saw flesh and blood. I saw a deeply flawed, highly destructive hazard I had successfully neutralized. He was simply a common criminal facing the weight of the law. Vivian, who had been standing frozen near the open tailgate of the black SUV, suddenly snapped back to awareness. She calculated quickly that Prescott's desperate deflections had failed entirely, and her survival instincts demanded she run. She spun sharply, heels digging into the mud, and broke into a frantic sprint toward the gap in the back fence. She didn't make it 5YD. A heavily armored federal agent surged forward with explosive speed, driving his shoulder hard into her midsection. He brought her down into the wet grass, pinning her arms behind her back with swift, absolute authority. Her expensive clothing was immediately coated in thick, dark mud as she thrashed and screamed, hurling venomous curses at the officers. The sharp, metallic click of handcuffs cut through the night air and finalized her capture. She was permanently detained, the vicious, manipulative reign she had enjoyed now, over for good. Watching his wife driven face first into the dirt shattered whatever thin thread of composure Prescott still held. His legs gave out under him. He collapsed heavily to his knees in the cold mud right beside the massive open trench he had dug to bury my reputation. The arrogance that had fueled his criminal enterprise drained away completely, leaving nothing behind but raw, unfiltered desperation. He looked up at me from the dirt face streaked with tears and mud alike. The man who moments ago had tried to consign me to a federal prison now abandoned aggression entirely and fell into pitiful begging. He reached his trembling hands toward my boots, his voice dissolving into a broken, miserable sob. "Dad, please!" He wailed, the sound ripping through the cold night. "Dad, tell them, please! You have to tell them it is yours. Tell them you made me do it." I stood over him, spine-straight expression, giving away nothing. The floodlights blazed across his pleading, terrified face, and I felt absolutely nothing in return. The fierce, protective warmth I had once carried for him was gone, replaced by cold, absolute resolve. The mud soaked into the knees of his fine, tailored trousers, permanently marking the very earth he had intended to use as my financial grave. I looked down at the groveling figure at my feet. The unforgiving glare of the federal tactical lights stripped away every trace of the polished corporate executive he had worked so hard to project, leaving only the hollow, frightened core of a desperate criminal exposed beneath. The armed agents held their tight, impenetrable perimeter around us, weapons lowered but attention unwavering. The silence of that freezing autumn night was broken by only one sound, the ragged, pathetic sobbing of my son into the cold, damp earth. He kept pleading without pause, voice cracking with high-pitched desperation, as he searched my expressionless face for any trace of the paternal mercy he had so casually planned to weaponize. He still believed he could talk his way out of this perfectly laid trap, that he could somehow persuade federal authorities that his frail elderly father was the true architect behind the staggering pile of illicit cash stacked in the open cargo bay of their idling vehicle. He was running on pure blind panic, utterly incapable of grasping the totality of what had just collapsed around him. The silent syndicate operatives watched him with open contempt, fully aware that his cowardly lies were going nowhere. I offered him no comfort, and I didn't raise my voice. I reached slowly into the deep inner pocket of my insulated winter jacket. Prescott's frantic pleading caught sharply in his throat, his wide, tear-streaked eyes tracking my deliberate movement with raw, animalistic fear. I drew out a sleek digital tablet, its glass screen cold against my weathered fingertips. I tapped the illuminated display, pulling up the secure, encrypted server where Corbett had carefully routed the live audio feed from the covert microphones concealed throughout the backyard canopy. I pushed the digital volume to its absolute limit, making certain every speaker was working at full capacity. With a steady hand, I pressed play. The crystal-clear, unmistakably authentic recording of Prescott's own arrogant voice rolled out into the quiet suburban night. The pristine playback captured every treacherous syllable he had spoken just minutes earlier. The federal agents, the remaining syndicate operatives, and Vivian, still pinned against the damp grass, listened without a sound, as Prescott's recorded voice proudly boasted about forging my signature on the criminal ledgers. The yard filled with the chilling echo of his explicit confession laying out in precise detail his plan to tip off federal authorities the instant I was warehoused in a nursing home. The recording even caught Vivienne's cruel, venomous laugh as she relished the prospect of my death inside a federal prison. The audio broadcast his carefully constructed plot to let me rot away in a maximum security penitentiary so he could walk free with my stolen assets. The undeniable clarity of that digital recording hung heavy in the freezing autumn air, an ironclad confession to a highly organized federal conspiracy. Prescott remained frozen in the thick mud mouth hanging open as the sound of his own treacherous words washed over him. Whatever blood remained in his face drained away, leaving him looking like a hollow, broken shell of a man. He was coming to understand that his ultimate fallback, his cowardly attempt to pin his crimes on me, had been captured in full on a secure federal recording. There was no gray area to argue, no clever loophole for his expensive lawyers to slide through, no way to shift the burden onto an innocent old man. The lead federal agent, tall and imposing with sharp, intelligent eyes and a stern, weathered face, stepped decisively into the illuminated circle. He issued no further verbal commands and entertained no more excuses. He simply reached down, grabbed Prescott by the muddy collar of his ruined suit jacket, and hauled him to his feet with undeniable authority. Prescott offered no physical resistance as the agent spun him around and pressed him face first against the cold, muddy side of the tactical truck. The sharp metallic ratchet of heavy steel handcuffs locking around Prescott's wrists rang through the yard with a satisfying, absolute finality. I watched the restraints applied and felt a deep, heavy sense of closure settle inside my chest. I took one slow, deliberate step forward, closing the distance between myself and the man who had torn our family apart. Prescott turned his head slightly, pressing his muddy cheek against the cold metal of the vehicle, his tear-filled eyes finding mine one last time. I spoke my first words to him since the trap had been set. My voice carried no emotion whatsoever, delivered with the calm, measured precision of an experienced engineer diagnosing a catastrophic structural failure. "You thought I was a clueless old man," I said quietly, making sure the words cut through the noise of the active crime scene. "But I spent 40 years building foundations that do not crack. You built yours on dirt." The reality of his failure crushed whatever was left of his manufactured confidence. Prescott let out a loud, agonizing wail, a sound born entirely of pure defeat. The lead federal agent jerked him back by his bound arms and dragged him across the torn lawn toward the flashing red and blue lights of the waiting cruisers lining the suburban street. Vivienne was hauled up from the wet grass, her expensive designer clothes ruined beyond salvaging by the thick mud. She screamed vicious, incoherent curses at the arresting officers as she was pushed into the back of a separate transport vehicle. Her fierce resistance proved entirely futile. The two silent syndicate men were marched away in heavy steel chains, their lucrative criminal careers permanently finished. I stood alone in the center of my badly damaged backyard, surrounded by the deep, muddy trench and scattered piles of dead autumn leaves. The tactical floodlights went dark, returning my home to the quiet darkness I had always valued. I turned away from the flashing street and walked slowly toward the back patio. Inside the dark, still house, I moved with a calm and purposeful stride. I didn't linger in the kitchen or the living room. I went straight down the familiar hallway and into my home office. I crossed to the heavy oak bookshelf, slid the thick wooden frame aside, and pulled the metal briefcase free from its dark, narrow recess. I set it firmly on my desk and reached for the dual combination dials ready to unlock the truth buried inside. The heavy metal dials clicked with sharp, resonant finality under my fingers. I aligned the combinations I had carefully worked out from my son's habitual numerical patterns. The thick latches sprang open, releasing a stale breath of trapped air into the quiet room. I lifted the lid, expecting stacks of illicit currency, but what I found was far more damning. The padded interior was meticulously organized, a thick stack of manila folders and a row of encrypted external hard drives. I pulled the top folder and spread the documents across my desk. They were the original untampered property deeds to my home, free of any forged signatures or shell company transfers. Beneath them lay the syndicate's true, highly detailed digital ledgers. Prescott had secretly documented every illegal transaction, every ghost contract, and every laundered dollar with terrifying precision. He had maintained this pristine, deeply incriminating evidence as his ultimate insurance policy. It was a calculated get-out-of-jail-free card, a devastating weapon he intended to level at his violent handlers if they ever came for him. He had foolishly believed he could play both sides of a dangerous game, feeding his father to the federal authorities, while holding the syndicate hostage with their own buried secrets. The staggering magnitude of his arrogance was preserved in those hidden files. I didn't spend a moment analyzing the financial data. I carefully returned the documents to the padded casing and secured the latches. I carried the briefcase out to the front porch, where the lead federal agent was coordinating the crime scene cleanup. The flashing red and blue lights painted long, shifting shadows across the brick exterior of my home. I walked directly to him and placed the steel container in his hands. I looked him straight in the eyes and told him exactly what he would find inside. I explained that those hard drives contained the complete unedited financial history of the money laundering operation, cleanly separated from the forged material Prescott had buried in my backyard. The agent accepted the briefcase, his stern expression giving way to a look of genuine, unmistakable respect. He assured me that this evidence would not only guarantee my full exoneration, but would systematically dismantle the entire overseas syndicate from the top down. He immediately directed his legal team to begin the expedited process of reversing the fraudulent property transfer. Within days, the fraudulent corporate deed would be entirely nullified, and my home returned to my name by law permanently. My sanctuary was finally beyond the reach of criminal hands. I withdrew into the quiet warmth of the house, the adrenaline that had driven me through the past 24 hours finally ebbing away. A deep, heavy exhaustion moved into my aging bones, pressing down on my shoulders and stiffening every tired joint. I made my way slowly through the kitchen and into the small utility mudroom off the back entrance. I dropped onto the wooden bench and looked down at my thick leather work boots. They were caked heavily in the dark mud from the violated trench in my backyard. The damp soil clung stubbornly to the deep rubber treads, a physical lingering mark of the violent treachery that had just poisoned my property. I picked up a stiff bristled brush and a damp rag and worked the dirt methodically from the worn leather. Every firm stroke of that brush felt therapeutic, a necessary physical outlet for the immense emotional pressure I had been holding down. I scrubbed until my calloused hands ached, refusing to quit until every trace of that tainted soil was gone from my boots. I wanted nothing of their dark work tracking through the halls of my home. The steady, repetitive motion slowly settled my racing mind, pulling me back toward the orderly, peaceful reality I had fought so hard to reclaim. As I wiped the last smear of damp earth from the clean leather, a sudden realization struck me with the force of something physical. My thoughts went back to the harsh, fluorescent light of the local pharmacy. Back to Mr. Huxley's battered, terrified face, his trembling, bruised hands, the absolute paralysis of fear behind his swollen eyes. The scattered pieces locked together with horrible clarity. Mr. Huxley had not been the victim of some random, opportunistic mugging. He was a tragic casualty of Prescott's violent syndicate. The poor man must have stumbled onto their illicit operations somehow, or perhaps his own quiet property had been eyed as a burial site before they shifted their focus to me. He had sensed the lethal danger closing around my son, and despite suffering severe physical retaliation for it, he had tried to warn me. He had put his fragile life at risk to deliver that desperate coded message about the soil and the clean names. A deep wave of gratitude moved through me. That brave old man had lit the spark that ultimately saved everything. I made a firm, unbreakable vow on the spot. First thing Monday morning, I would reach out to the hospital administration directly. I would anonymously cover every cent of his growing medical bills, ensuring he received the finest care available without carrying a dollar of it himself. The long, chaotic night finally gave way to a quiet, peaceful dawn. The harsh glare of the federal floodlights yielded to the soft warmth of the rising sun. I stepped out onto my wide front porch with a steaming ceramic mug of strong black coffee. The crisp autumn air filled my lungs, tasting cleaner and sweeter than it had in months. The suffocating shadow of my son's betrayal had been lifted from my shoulders for good. The suburban street outside was now a scene of orderly, satisfying justice. I stood on the wooden steps, both hands wrapped around the hot mug, watching two heavy-duty tow trucks back slowly into my driveway. The federal agents had moved quickly through their asset seizure protocols. I took a slow sip of the bitter coffee and watched thick steel chains hook onto the front axles of Prescott's sleek black SUV and Vivian's flashy imported sedan. The hydraulic winches strained and whined, dragging the expensive ill-gotten vehicles up onto the flatbed trailers. They were hauling away the hollow symbols of a corrupt empire built on lies and stolen money. I watched the trucks roll down the street and disappear around the corner, carrying the last toxic remnants of that chapter away with them. My home was quiet, my honor was intact, and my foundation had not cracked. I breathed in the morning air, turned the handle, and walked inside. 6 months have passed since that freezing autumn night, when the flashing lights of the federal cruisers lit up the darkest chapter of my life. The swift and thorough justice that followed stood as a direct testament to the power of the pristine digital ledgers I had surrendered. The federal courts moved with a cold, relentless efficiency. Prescott and Vivian were methodically stripped of their arrogant illusions and their stolen wealth. Confronted with the mountain of digital evidence and their own recorded confessions, their high-priced defense attorneys had nothing left to bargain with. The trial was brief, a clinical, almost sterile dismantling of their criminal enterprise. I sat in the front row of the courtroom, watching with calm, analytical detachment, as the prosecutors laid out the ironclad evidence piece by piece. Prescott refused to look my way. His shoulders were bent in total defeat, while Vivian wept openly as her vision of a luxurious future dissolved into the grim certainty of a concrete cell. The presiding federal judge extended no mercy to a son who had carefully plotted the destruction of his own father for financial gain. Prescott and Vivian were both sentenced to 15 years in a maximum security federal penitentiary with no possibility of parole. They will spend the next decade and a half confined to cold steel cells, completely cut off from the lavish existence they had so treacherously tried to steal. The overseas syndicate they had served was dismantled entirely. Their domestic operations were shattered by the cascading federal indictments triggered by those unedited hard drives. The violent men who had treated my quiet property as a dumping ground for their dark secrets were now facing the inescapable reality of lifetime sentences. My property, once contaminated by their greed, was quickly and legally returned to my name. The federal injunctions rapidly nullified the fraudulent corporate deed Prescott had orchestrated with such confidence. But walking through those empty, echoing rooms, I understood that the house was no longer a sanctuary. It had become a physical monument to a profound betrayal. The granite countertops and the heavy oak bookshelves no longer held the warmth of family memory. They only reflected the cold, calculated deception of the two people I had trusted most. I made a quick and absolute decision to sever what remained of my ties to that poisoned history. I put the property on the market, and it sold for a substantial profit within days. I packed only the genuine, untainted memories and left the heavy shadows behind for good. I simplified my life, buying a comfortable, well-appointed condominium, sitting directly on the tranquil shore of a pristine wooded lake just outside the city. It is a peaceful residence filled with natural light and genuine quiet. No forged documents hide behind the walls, no dark secrets lie buried in the soil. I wake every morning to the sound of water moving softly against the wooden docks, free from the corrosive anxiety that had consumed my days. The financial windfall from the sale presented me with a rare and powerful opportunity. I still carried the memory of the deep, paralyzing fear I had felt as Prescott calmly laid out his plan to institutionalize me permanently. The reality that a greedy child could manipulate the legal system to have an elderly parent declared incompetent and stripped of their rights haunted me long after it was over. I knew I had been fortunate. I had the intellect, the resources, and the loyal allies necessary to fight back. Many aging parents have none of those advantages. They are left defenseless, crushed by the sudden and heartbreaking betrayal of their own family. I chose to turn my pain into a shield for others. I directed the full proceeds from the real estate sale into establishing a comprehensive legal defense fund. The foundation is built specifically to protect vulnerable elderly individuals facing predatory financial abuse and the terrifying threat of forced non-consensual guardianship. We employ a dedicated team of tenacious, highly specialized attorneys and financial forensic investigators who pursue greedy relatives and corrupt caretakers without relenting. I spend my mornings reviewing complex case files, drawing on my decades of analytical engineering experience to pull apart the carefully constructed lies of abusive family members. We build airtight legal foundations for the people we represent, ensuring no arrogant opportunists can strip them of their dignity or their hard-earned legacy. The deep sadness of losing my son is now far outweighed by the profound sustaining purpose of protecting others from his precise brand of quiet, insidious cruelty. Every time we successfully overturn a fraudulent power of attorney, a deep sense of vindication settles over me. This afternoon, warm golden sunlight glances off the gentle ripples of the clear lake. I am settled comfortably in a small, sturdy fiberglass fishing boat, its easy rocking motion lending a soothing rhythm to the quiet day. Corbett sits relaxed at the far end of the vessel, expertly casting a bright orange fishing lure toward a cluster of submerged reeds near the rocky shoreline. We don't say much, entirely at ease, sharing the kind of comfortable silence that only exists between two men who have come through a dark and treacherous storm, side by side. He is a steadfast, loyal friend, the rare kind of genuine companion who plants himself firmly at your side when the very worst of humanity comes knocking at your front door. I draw a slow, deep breath of the crisp air and let the stillness wash over my relaxed shoulders. The natural landscape surrounding this peaceful lake stands in stark and magnificent contrast to the concrete walls and rigid steel bars currently confining my treacherous son. I close my eyes for a brief moment, listening to the distant melodic call of a solitary loon carrying across the wide expanse of shimmering water. I look down at my hands resting easily on the grip of my fishing rod. They are weathered and lined with age marked by the demands of a long life. Watching them hold the rod, I can see clearly that they are perfectly steady. They do not shake with fear, and they do not tremble with regret. These are the hands of a seasoned structural engineer who understood precisely how to dismantle a toxic structure before it could bury him. I came through that devastating betrayal by leaning entirely on patient intellect, unwavering discipline, and a flat refusal to become anyone's victim. I gave my enemies the room to dig their own deep graves, then calmly dropped the full weight of the bridge directly onto their arrogant heads. As the bright sun slides below the tall pines lining the horizon, long shadows stretch out across the calm water. A quiet smile finds my face. That dark chapter is firmly closed. I know with settled certainty that my life is far from finished. Never confuse the measured calm of an elderly parent for ignorance or frailty. A lifetime of experience, hardship, and survival sharpens a mind well beyond anything an arrogant opportunist could ever see coming. If you've stayed with me this long, then you already know this story didn't end in a nursing home. It ended in a courtroom with the truth on the table and the right people in handcuffs. I won't pretend it didn't cost me. Losing a son not to death, but to greed and deliberate cruelty leaves a particular kind of silence in a house. I believe God allowed me to see clearly when my own eyes wanted to look away. The discipline it took to stay quiet, to gather the proof, instead of confronting him, to trust the process over my own anger that wasn't strength I was born with. It was forged over decades. These grandpa revenge stories don't begin with a plan. They begin with a wound. Here is what I would pass on to anyone carrying something similar. First, never sign a legal document under emotional pressure. Read it, or have someone you trust read it for you. Your signature is your word in the eyes of the law. Second, if something feels wrong in your own home, trust that instinct. An old man's quiet observation is often sharper than a young man's loud confidence. Third, the evidence you gather in patience is always more powerful than the accusation you make in anger. Fourth, no matter your age, you still have the capacity to protect yourself and others. These father stories remind us that experience is its own kind of armor. If this reached you today, share it with someone who needs to hear it. A parent, a sibling, a friend who feels like the walls are closing in. Leave a comment and tell me what stayed with you. And if you haven't already, subscribe to Grandpa's Revenge so you don't miss what comes next. Thank you for sitting with me through this one. Take good care of yourself, and I'll see you in the next story.